"You can't even read," Daniel Whitmore said with a laugh that didn't just fill the room, it owned it, the kind of laugh that had ended careers, silenced objections, and reminded everyone exactly who held the power, and in that moment, as the words echoed against the glass walls and polished table stretching nearly 20 feet down the center of the executive boardroom, he believed this would be no different. Just another small humiliation, just another reminder that in his company, hierarchy wasn't questioned, it was obeyed. The city skyline behind him shimmered through floor-to-ceiling windows, late afternoon light cutting sharp lines across marble floors and tailored suits, each executive seated perfectly still, their posture trained by years of knowing when to speak and more importantly when not to, and right now, no one spoke, because the target had already been chosen. Evelyn Carter stood at the far end of the table, slightly off-center, like she hadn't been meant to be seen. In the first place, her simple gray blouse blending into the neutral tones of the room, her hands steady but quiet as she held a printed report, the kind assistants carried but never presented, the kind people like her were expected to pass along, not understand. She had been in the company barely 6 weeks, a temporary hire, someone HR barely remembered approving, and yet somehow, she had ended up here. In the one place where mistakes weren't just noticed, they were remembered. Daniel stepped closer, the faint click of his leather shoes against the floor echoing louder than it should have, or maybe it just felt that way because every movement he made carried weight, the weight of authority, expectation, and control, and when he reached her, he didn't look at her like a person, he looked at her like a demonstration, a point he was about to make. "Go ahead," he said, tapping the document in her hand with 2 fingers, casual, dismissive, read it out loud, and a few of the executives shifted, subtle glances exchanged, not out of concern, but anticipation, because they had seen this before, the slow dismantling of someone who didn't belong, the kind of moment that reinforced order. A low chuckle slipped from somewhere near the middle of the table, quickly suppressed, but not unnoticed, and just like that, the atmosphere tilted, not chaotic, not loud, but sharp, focused, every eye drawn to the quiet woman standing at the edge of a moment she hadn't asked for. Evelyn didn't move right away, and that pause, that fraction of a second, stretched longer than it should have, long enough for Daniel's smile to widen slightly, long enough for someone to lean back in their chair. Expecting hesitation, expecting embarrassment, expecting exactly what always happened next, because in rooms like this, silence usually meant surrender, but what no one in that room realized, not even for a second, was that this silence wasn't hesitation, it wasn't fear, it was calculation, the kind that didn't announce itself, the kind that waited for the exact moment to speak, and when it did, it didn't ask for permission. Evelyn lifted her gaze slowly, meeting Daniel's eyes not with defiance, not with emotion, but with something far more unsettling, certainty, and in a voice so calm it cut through the tension like a blade, she asked, "Would you like me to read it, or explain what's wrong with it?" And just like that, something invisible shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself had realized the rules were about to change, and for the first time since he entered the room, Daniel Whitmore didn't answer immediately. For a brief second, Daniel Whitmore simply stared at her, not because he did not understand the question, but because no one had ever asked him one like that, not in this room, not in this company, not in front of people who had spent years learning to avoid even the appearance of challenging him, and yet here she was, standing in the same quiet posture, holding the same document, but somehow no longer blending into the background. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there, and everyone felt it, even if no one dared to acknowledge it. Daniel let out a short breath that sounded almost like a scoff, recovering quickly, because men like him did not hesitate for long. They recalibrated, they redirected, they reasserted control, and that was exactly what he intended to do. He straightened slightly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, his voice returning to its familiar edge as he said, "There is nothing wrong with it," each word deliberate, measured, designed to close the moment before it could open into something unpredictable. "But by all means, go ahead, read it," and there it was, the command, the expectation, the unspoken rule that she would comply, stumble, and restore the natural order of the room. A few executives exchanged glances again, more carefully this time, because something about her tone had unsettled them, something about the way she had not rushed to defend herself, had not reacted emotionally, had not done anything they expected. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly to the report, not in submission, but in focus, her fingers adjusting the pages with precise, unhurried movements, and that calm, that deliberate pace, began to stretch the silence in a way that felt different now, heavier, more attentive, as if the room itself was leaning in. The faint hum of the overhead light seemed louder, the distant sound of traffic from 20 floors below barely noticeable compared to the quiet that had settled over the table. She began to read, her voice steady, clear, not loud, but carrying easily across the room, each word articulated with a confidence that did not ask for approval, and at first, it seemed ordinary, just numbers, projections, quarterly forecasts, the kind of content everyone there had seen 100 times before. Daniel leaned back slightly, arms crossing, the corner of his mouth lifting again as if to say this was exactly what he had expected, a performance that would lead nowhere. But then she paused, not long, just enough to mark a transition, and when she continued, something in her tone shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The revenue projection for the third quarter assumes a growth rate of 12%, she said, her eyes lifting from the page, not to challenge, but to connect, to make sure every person in that room heard what came next. But that assumption is based on last year's expansion model, which no longer applies after the restructuring in April, and just like that, a ripple moved through the table, small, almost imperceptible, but real. One executive straightened, another frowned slightly, a pen that had been tapping stopped mid-motion. Daniel's expression did not change immediately, but the confidence behind it flickered, just for a fraction of a second, because he recognized the numbers, he recognized the model, and more importantly, he recognized that she was not guessing. Evelyn turned a page, her movements still controlled, still quiet, as she continued, if the current model is applied correctly, the projected growth rate would be closer to 4.6%, not 12, she said, and now the room was no longer just quiet, it was attentive, focused in a way that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with accuracy. She did not stop there, did not rush, did not over-explain, she simply moved forward, connecting the implications, which means the forecasted revenue for Q3 is overstated by approximately $2.4 million, and this time, the silence landed differently, not empty, not passive, but heavy, as if every person in that room understood exactly what that number meant. Daniel uncrossed his arms slowly, the movement almost unnoticeable, but for those watching closely, it was enough, because in a room built on control, the smallest shift could speak louder than any words, and for the first time since the meeting began, the balance had started to move, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably, and no one was laughing anymore. No one spoke, not because they did not have something to say, but because every instinct in that room told them this was not a moment to interrupt, it was a moment to observe, to measure, to understand exactly what was unfolding in front of them. Evelyn Carter did not look around to gauge their reactions, she did not seek validation, she simply continued, turning another page with the same quiet precision, her voice steady, controlled, almost surgical in the way it moved from one point to the next. The variance does not stop there, she said, her tone unchanged, as if she were discussing something routine, something expected, and yet each word seemed to tighten the air further, because the projected cost structure still reflects pre-restructuring operational expenses, and now even those who had remained relaxed began to shift, shoulders straightening, eyes narrowing, because they knew exactly what that implied. Daniel Whitmore stood still, his expression composed, but the stillness was different now, less about control and more about calculation, his mind moving quickly, retracing the report, the assumptions, the numbers he had already approved, numbers he had presented with certainty just minutes earlier. Evelyn did not pause for long, just enough to let the weight of the statement settle, before continuing. If the updated cost model is applied, the margin decreases by an additional 3.2%, she said, and this time, someone at the far end of the table exhaled softly, almost involuntarily, the sound barely audible, but in a room this quiet, it carried the confidence that had filled the space at the beginning of the meeting was no longer intact. It had begun to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but in small, undeniable shifts that no one could ignore. Daniel finally moved, a subtle step forward, his gaze fixed on the report in her hands, as if seeing it for the first time, not as a finished document, but as something unfinished, something flawed, something that now demanded attention. That is a projection, he said, his voice controlled, but lower than before, less performative, more deliberate. not a certainty, and it was the first time he had responded without the edge of mockery, the first time his words were not designed to dominate but to reframe. Evelyn nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding it. Yes, she replied, her tone even, respectful, but unwavering. But the current projection assumes conditions that no longer exist, and there it was again, that calm certainty. Not aggressive, not defensive, simply factual, and that made it harder to challenge, harder to dismiss. She placed the report gently on the table, sliding it forward just enough for those closest to see the highlighted figures, the corrected calculations, the clean, precise adjustments. That left no room for interpretation, and as the pages settled, so did the realization, slow but undeniable, that this was not a mistake, not a lucky observation, not a moment of accidental clarity. This was understanding, deep, structured, and exact. The room did not erupt, there were no sudden reactions, no dramatic outbursts, just a collective stillness that spoke louder than anything else. A silence filled with recalibration, with the quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted beyond anyone's expectation. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, not in anger, but in recognition, because the numbers were there, the logic was there, and more importantly, the implication was there, that the strategy he had endorsed, the one he had defended, was not just slightly off, it was fundamentally flawed. He looked up from the report, his eyes meeting Evelyn's again, and this time, there was no dismissal in his gaze, no amusement, just a measured, focused attention, as if he were trying to place her, to understand how someone who had stood unnoticed minutes ago could now hold the entire room in silence. And for the first time since he had spoken those words, he did not look like the man in control of the narrative, he looked like someone listening, truly listening, because the room had changed, and whether he acknowledged it or not, everyone else already had. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling into the room like something tangible, something that pressed against every polished surface and tailored sleeve, and for a moment, no one moved because no one was entirely sure what the next move was supposed to be anymore. This was not how these meetings went, this was not how power behaved, and yet here they were, watching it shift in real time. Daniel Whitmore reached forward slowly, his hand hovering over the report before finally resting on it, fingers pressing lightly against the paper as if grounding himself in something solid, something familiar, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, not weaker, but stripped of the performance it carried before. Walk me through it, he said, the words measured, controlled, but undeniably a request rather than a command. A subtle exchange of glances moved across the table, not bold enough to be obvious, but present, because everyone understood what that meant, the tone, the shift, the quiet acknowledgement that the dynamic had changed. Evelyn Carter did not react with surprise, did not hesitate, she simply inclined her head slightly and stepped closer to the table, her movement still calm, still precise. As if this had always been the natural next step, she placed her hand near the report, not touching his, but close enough to guide the focus, and began again, this time slower, more deliberate. The issue begins here, she said, indicating a section of the document, her voice steady, almost instructional, but never condescending. The model assumes that post-restructuring efficiency gains would offset reduced expansion. But the data from the last 2 quarters shows that the transition period is longer than projected, and as she spoke, something shifted again, not in her, but in the room, because now they were not just listening, they were following, tracing her logic, seeing the structure behind her words. One executive leaned forward slightly, another adjusted their glasses, the attention no longer forced, but earned. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the figures, his expression tightening not in resistance, but in focus, the kind of focus that came from recognizing a pattern too late. Evelyn continued without pause, if we adjust the timeline to reflect a realistic transition period, the efficiency gains do not stabilize until late Q4, she explained, her finger moving lightly across the page, guiding the sequence, which means any projections for Q3 that rely on those gains are inherently inflated, and there it was again, clear, direct, impossible to ignore. A pen rolled slightly across the table, unnoticed by its owner, as the weight of her explanation settled over them. Daniel exhaled quietly, the sound controlled, but present, his hand shifting slightly on the report as if recalibrating his grip on the situation, and for a brief moment, his eyes lifted from the page to her, not with challenge, but with something closer to recognition. This was no longer About a misstep, no longer about correcting a detail, this was about understanding something fundamental that had been overlooked, and she had seen it. The room remained still, but the stillness was no longer uncertain, it was focused, intentional, every person there aware that they were witnessing a recalibration of authority, not announced, not declared, but unfolding with quiet precision. Evelyn stepped back just slightly, giving space, not retreating, but allowing the information to stand on its own, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as if she had simply done what was expected of her, nothing more, nothing less, and that was perhaps the most unsettling part of all, because there was no attempt to claim the moment, no visible desire to prove anything, just clarity, delivered without hesitation. Daniel straightened slowly, his shoulders settling into a posture that was no longer about dominance, but about control regained in a different way, a quieter way, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight it had not held before, not louder, not sharper, but grounded. "How long have you been reviewing these reports?" he asked, the question simple on the surface, but heavy with implication, and in the silence that followed, every person in that room understood that the answer was going to matter far more than anyone had expected just minutes ago. The question did not echo, it settled, heavy and deliberate, hanging in the air like something that demanded more than a simple answer, and for a moment, no one shifted, no one looked away, because they all understood that this was no longer about a report, it was about her. Evelyn Carter met Daniel Whitmore's gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, unreadable, as if the weight of the room had never pressed against her in the first place, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet clarity that had reshaped everything in the last few minutes. "Since my first day," she said, and the simplicity of the answer landed harder than anything she had said before. A subtle ripple moved through the executives, not loud, not visible to an untrained eye, but undeniable, because 6 weeks was not enough time for someone in her position to understand this level of detail, not unless they had been looking deeper than anyone expected. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recalibration, his mind adjusting to a reality that did not fit the narrative he had constructed moments earlier, and for the first time, there was no immediate response, no quick assertion to reclaim control, just silence. Intentional, thoughtful silence. Evelyn did not fill it, she did not elaborate, she simply stood there, composed, allowing the answer to exist on its own terms, and that restraint, that refusal to over-explain, only made the moment more precise, more defined. One of the senior executives, a man who had not spoken the entire meeting, leaned forward slightly, his voice measured but carrying a new kind of attention. "You identified this on your own?" he asked, not challenging, but confirming. And Evelyn turned her gaze briefly toward him, acknowledging the question. With a small nod, "The data was already there," she replied, her tone steady, "it just needed to be aligned correctly," and again, the room absorbed it, not just the words, but the implication, that the oversight had not been hidden, not been complex, just missed. Daniel's hand moved away from the report slowly, as if the document itself no longer belonged to him in the same way, his posture shifting, not weaker, but different, less about projection and more about presence, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, not diminished, but grounded in a way that carried more weight than before. "Why did no one else catch this?" he asked, not directing the question at her alone, but at the room, at the system, at the structure that had allowed such a gap to exist. No one answered immediately, because no one had a clean answer, no one had a justification that would not sound like an excuse in this moment. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was revealing, a mirror held up to a room full of experienced professionals who had all accepted the same assumptions without question. Evelyn remained still, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her role unchanged in form, but completely transformed in substance, and as Daniel's gaze returned to her, there was something new in it, something that had not been there before, not respect fully formed, not yet, but the beginning of it, the recognition that what stood in front of him was not what he had assumed. The city outside continued as it always had, distant traffic, shifting light, the rhythm of a world unaffected by what was happening 20 floors above, but inside that room, something fundamental had shifted. Something that would not simply reset when the meeting ended, and as Daniel straightened, drawing a slow breath, every person at that table understood, without a single word being spoken, that whatever came next would not follow the pattern they were used to, because the rules, the invisible ones that had governed every interaction until now, had just been rewritten. The room did not recover quickly, it adjusted slowly, like something realigning after a shift no one had prepared for, and in that adjustment, the weight of what had just happened continued to settle deeper into every corner of the space. Daniel Whitmore did not immediately reclaim the conversation, which in itself was enough to hold everyone in place, because hesitation was not something they associated with him. Not in this room, not in any room, and yet here it was, not weakness, but consideration, deliberate and visible. He turned slightly, his gaze moving across the table, not searching for agreement, not seeking support, but measuring, recalibrating, understanding exactly how far the impact of this moment had spread, and it was clear, no one was looking at Evelyn Carter the same way anymore. She was no longer a background figure, no longer an overlooked presence. She had become the center of something none of them could ignore, not because she demanded attention, but because she had earned it without asking. Daniel stepped back from the table just slightly, creating space not just physically, but symbolically, a subtle shift that signaled a change in posture, in approach, in the way he intended to move forward, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a level tone that cut cleanly through the silence. "If the projections are adjusted based on your model," he said, each word precise, intentional, "what does that mean for the timeline of the rollout?" And there was no sarcasm in the question, no challenge hidden beneath it, just focus. Evelyn did not hesitate, not even for a second, as if the answer had already been considered long before the question was asked. "It would require a phased delay of approximately 6 to 8 weeks, she replied, her voice steady, her posture unchanged, with priority shifted toward stabilizing operational efficiency before expansion resumes, and as she spoke, the structure of her reasoning unfolded with clarity, each point connected, each implication grounded in data rather than assumption. One of the executives reached for a pen, not out of habit, but necessity now, jotting down notes that suddenly felt relevant, urgent even, while another leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, fully engaged in a way that had not existed at the start of the meeting. Daniel nodded once, a small, controlled motion, but one that carried acknowledgement, not agreement yet, but recognition of a framework that demanded consideration. "And the risk if we proceed without adjustment?" he asked, and again, the room held its breath, not in tension this time, but in anticipation, because the answer would not just define the problem, it would define the consequence. Evelyn's gaze remained steady, her tone unchanged. "The margin compression would accelerate," she said, "and the projected gains would not materialize within the expected timeframe, which would likely impact investor confidence by the end of the fiscal quarter." And there it was, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just clear, direct, unavoidable. A quiet shift moved through the executives, a recognition that the conversation had crossed a line, from internal discussion to external implication, from numbers on a page to consequences in the real world. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand resting lightly on the back of a chair now, no longer gripping the report, no longer anchoring himself to what had already been said, but standing in the space of what needed to be decided next. And for the first time, there was no immediate move to close the discussion, no attempt to steer it back into familiar territory, because the familiar had already been disrupted. He looked at Evelyn again, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as a source, and in that look, there was something unmistakable, a shift that everyone in that room could see even if no one would name it, the beginning of a new dynamic, one not defined by position alone, but by understanding, by clarity, by the quiet authority that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. And as the silence settled once more, it was no longer the silence of uncertainty, it was the silence of recognition, the kind that comes when a room realizes it has just witnessed something it cannot unsee. No one rushed to speak after that, not because the conversation had ended, but because it had reached a point where every word carried weight, and no one wanted to be the one to disrupt what was now unfolding with such quiet precision. The room had transformed from a place of hierarchy into something far more dangerous, a place of clarity, and clarity did not bend to authority, it demanded response. Daniel Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, his posture no longer projecting dominance, but control of a different kind, the kind that required restraint, calculation, and the willingness to listen before acting. And when he finally moved, it was subtle, a shift of his stance, a slight turn back toward the table, signaling that the meeting was not over, it was evolving. "If we delay," he said slowly, his voice measured, each word placed carefully. What is the opportunity cost? And the question did not come with challenge, it came with expectation, not of failure, but of insight. Evelyn Carter did not need to look back at the report this time, her answer already formed, already structured, as if she had walked through this scenario long before anyone else had considered it. There will be short-term perception risk, she replied, her tone steady, composed, but the adjusted model would strengthen long-term stability, which is more critical given current market conditions, and as she spoke, her reasoning did not just fill the space, it anchored it, providing something solid for everyone else to stand on. One of the executives nodded almost imperceptibly, another leaned forward further, the attention no longer divided, no longer cautious, but fully engaged, because this was no longer about following a meeting agenda, this was about understanding a shift in direction. Daniel's eyes remained on her, not searching for flaws, but tracing the logic, testing it silently, the way someone does when they recognize something that cannot be dismissed lightly. And for the first time since the meeting began, there was no trace of the earlier tone, no echo of dismissal, only focus, and implementation. He asked, his voice quieter now, not because it lacked authority, but because it no longer needed to prove it. How would you execute the adjustment without signaling instability? And the room held still again, but not in tension, in anticipation, because the answer would define not just the problem, but the path forward. Evelyn took a small breath, not out of hesitation, but rhythm, the natural pause before clarity. By reframing the delay as a strategic optimization, she said, her words precise, deliberate, communicating a focus on operational efficiency before expansion, supported by revised projections that align with realistic timelines. And as she spoke, the structure of the plan unfolded, not rushed, not exaggerated, but grounded, each piece fitting into place with a level of coherence that left little room for doubt. A pen scratched lightly against paper now, not out of habit, but necessity, because this was information that needed to be captured, not remembered vaguely. Daniel nodded again, slightly more pronounced this time, the motion carrying acknowledgement, not just of the answer, but of the mind behind it, and that acknowledgement did not go unnoticed, not by the executives, not by the room, and certainly not by Evelyn, even though her expression did not change. The silence that followed was no longer empty, it was full, filled with recalculation, with shifting perspectives, with the quiet realization that the structure they had relied on was not as fixed as they had believed. Daniel turned his gaze briefly toward the rest of the table, and in that glance, there was a question, unspoken but clear, and no one rushed to answer it, because for the first time, the answer was not expected to come from them. When his attention returned to Evelyn, it lingered a moment longer, not assessing, not judging, but recognizing, and in that moment, something settled into place. Something that could not be reversed, because once a room sees clarity like that, once it recognizes it, it cannot go back to ignoring it. And as the quiet stretched once more, it was no longer about what had happened, but about what would happen next, because the balance had already shifted, and everyone in that room knew it, even if no one had yet said it out loud. The silence no longer felt like a pause, it felt like a turning point, the kind that did not announce itself but changed everything once it passed. And in that quiet, something deeper began to surface, not in Evelyn Carter's voice, not in her posture, but in the realization spreading across the room that what they were witnessing was not situational, it was structural. Daniel Whitmore did not rush to speak this time, and that restraint carried more weight than any directive he had given earlier. Because it signaled something far more significant than authority, it signaled adaptation. He moved back toward the head of the table, not reclaiming space in the way he had before, but repositioning within it, his presence still commanding, but no longer unquestioned. And when he finally spoke, his tone was lower, steadier. You said you have been reviewing these since your first day, he said, not as a challenge, but as a continuation. What else did you see? And the question landed with quiet force, because it acknowledged something none of them had prepared for, that this was not an isolated observation, it was part of a larger understanding. Evelyn did not look surprised by the question, nor did she rush to answer it. She simply allowed a brief pause, just enough to shift the room's attention fully onto what would come next, and then she spoke. There are inconsistencies in the regional allocation strategy, she said, her tone unchanged, but the implication immediate, specifically in how resources were redistributed after the restructuring, and a subtle tension moved through the table again, not defensive, but alert, because now they were no longer dealing with one flaw, but a pattern. Daniel's expression remained composed, but his focus sharpened, his attention narrowing as if aligning with her perspective. Tracing the structure she was revealing piece by piece, Evelyn stepped slightly closer to the table again, not to dominate the space, but to guide it, her hand resting near another section of the report. The current allocation assumes uniform recovery across all regions, she continued, but the data indicates that some regions are stabilizing faster than others, which creates an imbalance in resource distribution. And as she spoke, the clarity of the issue unfolded, not as criticism, but as correction, precise and grounded. One of the executives shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced with concentration. Another leaned forward further, eyes fixed on the figures as if seeing them differently for the first time. Daniel's gaze followed the line of her explanation, his mind moving quickly, recalibrating again, and this time, there was no resistance, only recognition. Which regions? He asked, his voice direct, focused, and the question came without hesitation. Because the conversation had moved beyond validation, it had entered application. Evelyn answered just as steadily, naming the regions, outlining the disparities, connecting each point with the same quiet precision that had defined everything she had said so far, and with each detail, the room adjusted again, not dramatically, but definitively. The structure they had trusted was being re-examined in real time, not by a committee, not by a team, but by someone who had been standing unnoticed among them just minutes earlier. Daniel nodded once more, slower this time, as if absorbing not just the information, but the implication of its source, and when his eyes lifted to meet hers again, there was no trace of the earlier dismissal left, only a measured, undeniable awareness. The room remained still, but it was no longer waiting, it was following, and in that shift, something irreversible settled into place, because once a voice proves itself with clarity like that, once it reshapes the way a room thinks, it cannot be reduced again, it cannot be dismissed again. And as the quiet held, not empty but full, every person there understood that the conversation was no longer about whether she was right, it was about what they were going to do now that they knew she was. The room had crossed a threshold, and no one could step back from it now, not even Daniel Whitmore, because the conversation had moved beyond authority, beyond hierarchy, into something far more absolute. Truth revealed in real time, and truth, once spoken clearly, did not bend. Evelyn Carter stood exactly where she had been, not at the head of the table, not elevated in position, but anchored in something far more powerful, clarity. And as the weight of her previous words settled deeper into the room, Daniel did something no one there had ever seen him do before. He paused without filling the silence, allowing it to exist, allowing it to stretch, and in that silence, the entire dynamic of the meeting shifted once again. His gaze moved from Evelyn to the rest of the executives, scanning the table not for agreement, but for awareness, measuring how far the realization had spread, and it was clear. Every person in that room understood now that what they had accepted as stable was anything but. He placed both hands lightly on the table, leaning forward just enough to signal engagement, not dominance, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that felt different from before, not louder, but sharper, more focused. If this allocation imbalance continues, he said slowly, each word deliberate, what does it lead to by the end of the fiscal year? And the question did not challenge Evelyn. It acknowledged her position in the conversation, placing her at the center of the answer. Evelyn did not rush, did not dramatize, she simply responded. It creates compounding inefficiencies. Her tone steady, her words precise. Overfunded regions will plateau early while underfunded regions will fail to stabilize, which reduces overall performance below projected benchmarks. And as she spoke, the outcome unfolded logically, not as speculation, but as an inevitable sequence. A quiet tension moved through the room, not resistance, but recognition, because the picture she painted was not hypothetical, it was measurable, trackable, unavoidable. One executive leaned back slowly, exhaling under his breath, while another adjusted their posture, the subtle movements of people recalibrating their understanding in real time. Daniel's expression remained composed, but the shift in his focus was unmistakable. He was no longer evaluating her, he was integrating what she was saying into the broader structure of decision-making, and that shift carried more weight than any verbal acknowledgement could have. "And the correction?" he asked, his voice steady, direct, and again, the room held still, not out of tension, but anticipation, because this was no longer about identifying problems, it was about defining the path forward. Evelyn stepped closer to the report once more, her hand moving lightly across the page as if aligning the structure in front of them. "Reallocate resources based on actual recovery rates," she said, her tone unchanged. "Prioritize regions demonstrating early stabilization, and implement a staggered reinvestment model for those lagging behind." And as she spoke, the plan unfolded with the same clarity as her earlier analysis, not rushed, not embellished, but structured, actionable. A pen moved again across paper, faster this time, the sound subtle but present, because what she was outlining was not just insight, it was direction. Daniel nodded slowly, the motion more visible now, more deliberate, and when his eyes lifted to meet hers again, there was no trace of the earlier dismissal left, no echo of the laughter that had started this moment. Only a measured, undeniable respect beginning to take shape, not declared, not spoken, but there. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty, it was the silence of alignment, the kind that forms when a group recognizes a truth they cannot ignore, and as that silence settled, something became clear to everyone present. This was no longer Daniel Whitmore's meeting in the way it had been before, because control had shifted, not through force, not through challenge, but through something far more powerful, understanding, and once that kind of understanding takes hold, it does not fade, it redefines everything that comes after. The air in the boardroom no longer felt like it belonged to a single voice, it belonged to the weight of what had been uncovered, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel Whitmore did not rush to fill it with certainty, because certainty, as it turned out, had just been rewritten. He remained at the head of the table, but the position no longer carried the same automatic dominance, it now required something else. Something earned in real time, and that realization did not escape anyone. Seated there, his fingers tapped once, lightly against the polished surface, not out of impatience, but rhythm, a recalibration of thought, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a level calm that felt sharper than any command. "Then we restructure the rollout," he said, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as a decision forming in motion, and yet, even in that declaration, there was something new, something measured, because this decision was no longer built on assumption. It was built on correction. He turned slightly toward the rest of the executives, his gaze moving deliberately across each face. "We adjust projections, we revise allocation, and we communicate the shift as strategic alignment," he continued, and while the words were his, the foundation beneath them was not entirely his anymore, and everyone in the room knew it. A few nods followed, subtle but present, not out of obligation, but agreement, because the logic now stood on something stronger than authority, it stood on clarity. Daniel's attention returned to Evelyn Carter, and this time, there was no trace of the earlier tone left, no shadow of dismissal, only focus, direct and unmistakable. "You will prepare a revised model," he said, his voice steady, but the weight of the statement carried something more than instruction, it carried recognition, even if it was not spoken outright. "I want full projections, adjusted timelines, and risk analysis by tomorrow morning," and the room shifted again, because that was not a task given lightly, not in this company, not in this room, and certainly not to someone who had walked in as an afterthought. Evelyn did not react with surprise, did not hesitate, she simply nodded once, a small, controlled motion that matched everything she had shown so far: precision, clarity, composure. "Understood," she replied, her voice even, as if the responsibility being placed on her was nothing more than a natural extension of what had already begun. One of the senior executives glanced toward her briefly, then back to Daniel, the unspoken question lingering in his expression, but it was never voiced, because the moment had already answered it. Daniel's gaze lingered on Evelyn for a fraction longer than before, not evaluating, not testing, but acknowledging, and in that look there was something unmistakable, a shift that could not be reversed, because once authority recognizes competence in that way, it cannot pretend it does not exist. He straightened fully, reclaiming his posture, but not his previous tone, because that tone no longer fit the room. "We reconvene at 9 a.m., he said, his voice carrying across the table with quiet precision, with updated data, and just like that, the meeting moved toward closure, but not resolution, because what had happened in that room did not end with a decision, it began something else entirely. Chairs shifted softly, papers gathered, but no one spoke loudly, no one broke the atmosphere that still lingered, because even in movement, the realization remained, something had changed in a way that would not reset once they walked out of that room. Evelyn stepped back slightly, returning to the space she had occupied before. But it was not the same space anymore, it could not be, because every person there now knew exactly who she was, not by title, not by position, but by what she had revealed, and as Daniel turned away, already thinking ahead, one truth settled quietly into the room, the kind that did not need to be spoken. To be understood, this was no longer just his company to lead the way he always had, because someone he had overlooked had just rewritten the way decisions would be made from this moment forward. The meeting did not end with noise, it dissolved into a quiet that followed them out of the room, a quiet that lingered in the hallway, in the elevator, in the subtle glances exchanged between executives who had just witnessed something they could not easily explain, and as the glass doors closed behind them one by one, the energy of the boardroom did not disappear, it carried forward, settling into every step they took. Evelyn Carter did not rush, she gathered the report with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning, her movements unhurried, controlled, as if nothing extraordinary had just taken place, and that composure, that lack of reaction, only made the moment feel more significant, because it meant this was not new to her, it was simply revealed. A few of the executives passed by her as they exited, their expressions no longer dismissive, no longer indifferent, but measured, thoughtful, some offering a brief nod, others a glance that lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, subtle acknowledgments that something had shifted, even if no one was ready to define it out loud. Daniel Whitmore remained in the room longer than the others, standing near the head of the table, his gaze fixed not on the skyline beyond the glass, but on the empty chair where Evelyn had stood earlier, and for a moment, the stillness around him felt different, not commanding, but reflective, the kind of stillness that comes when certainty has been challenged and replaced with something more precise. He moved slowly, collecting his thoughts in the same deliberate way he had adjusted his tone throughout the meeting, and as he reached for the report left on the table, his hand paused just above it, as if recognizing that the document itself no longer represented what it had before. It was no longer just a projection, it was evidence of oversight, of assumption, of a system that had operated without question until now. He picked it up, flipping through the pages. Again, not quickly, not dismissively, but carefully, tracing the corrections Evelyn had pointed out, seeing them now with a clarity that had not existed when the meeting began, and with each page, the realization deepened. This was not luck, this was not a one-time observation, this was understanding built over time, quiet, consistent, and unnoticed. Outside the room, Evelyn stepped into the hallway. The soft hum of the office returning around her, the rhythm of conversations, the distant sound of phones ringing, the ordinary flow of a workplace that had no idea what had just taken place 20 floors above, and yet, as she walked, something had changed, not in her pace, not in her posture, but in the way the space responded to her, the subtle awareness in passing glances, the slight pause in movement as others recognized her presence, even if they could not explain why. She reached her desk, placing the report down gently, her fingers resting on the edge of the paper for a brief moment, not in hesitation, but in thought, because what had happened in that room was not just a correction, it was a shift, one that would carry forward into every decision that followed. Inside the boardroom, Daniel closed the report slowly, his expression set not in frustration, but in focus, the kind that comes when a leader recognizes that the path ahead has changed, and as he turned toward the door, one truth settled firmly into place. Something he could not ignore, not anymore, because it had been proven in front of him, beyond question, beyond assumption. The quietest voice in the room had just redefined the direction of everything, and from this point forward, he would have to decide not just how to lead, but who he had been overlooking all along. The evening did not slow down for Evelyn Carter, even though the world around her seemed to carry on as if nothing had changed, as if the quiet shift that had taken place in that boardroom was just another meeting lost in a schedule filled with deadlines and projections. But for her, the weight of what had been set in motion did not fade, it sharpened. She sat at her desk long after the usual rhythm of the office had thinned, the overhead lights casting a steady glow across spreadsheets, charts, and handwritten notes that now stretched beyond the original report, because what she had started was no longer about correction, it was about reconstruction. her fingers moved across the keyboard with controlled precision, each adjustment deliberate, each recalculation grounded in the same clarity that had silenced the room earlier, and there was no rush in her movements. No panic, just focus, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where the structure needs to change. Outside her glass partition, the office had quieted, conversations replaced by the low hum of systems running overnight processes, the distant sound of a cleaning cart moving down the hallway, the ordinary details of a space winding down, unaware that something fundamental was being rebuilt within it. Across the floor, a few late working analysts paused more than once, glancing in her direction, their curiosity no longer hidden behind indifference, because word had already begun to move, not loudly, not officially, but through the quiet channels that carried the truth faster than any announcement. Something had happened in that meeting, something unexpected, and her name was now part of that conversation. Evelyn did not acknowledge the attention, she did not look up, because the work in front of her demanded more than awareness, it demanded precision, and that was where her focus remained. Lines of data shifted under her review, projections realigned. Timelines adjusted, each section of the model transforming into something more stable, more grounded, and as the hours passed, the document on her screen no longer resembled the one she had been handed earlier that day. It had become something else entirely, something that reflected not just correction, but understanding. Across the building, in an office that overlooked the same city skyline now fading into night, Daniel Whitmore remained at his desk as well, the lights still on, the report open in front of him, but untouched for several minutes at a time as his attention moved beyond the numbers and into something deeper, something more difficult to quantify. He leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the reflection of the city lights against the glass, and for the first time in a long time, the silence around him was not filled with plans, it was filled with reconsideration, because leadership, as he understood it, had always been about direction, about certainty, about moving forward without hesitation. But what he had seen earlier challenged that definition in a way he could not ignore. His hand moved slowly to the report, flipping a page, then another, not searching for errors this time, but tracing the logic that had been revealed, understanding it not as a correction to his authority, but as a necessary evolution of it. Back at her desk, Evelyn paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the final section of the revised model, the numbers aligned, the structure complete, and as she leaned back slightly, the quiet around her settled into something different, not tension, not anticipation, but readiness, because what she had built would not just answer the questions raised in that room, it would redefine the decisions that followed. And somewhere between the silence of her workspace and the stillness of Daniel's office, a single realization connected them both, unspoken but undeniable. Tomorrow morning would not be a continuation of what had been, it would be the beginning of something entirely different, because once clarity enters a system built on assumption, it does not simply adjust it, it transforms it, and neither of them would walk into that room the same way again. The next morning did not arrive with noise, it arrived with precision, the kind that settles into a room before anyone even speaks, and as the clock approached 9 a.m., the boardroom filled again, not with the same casual confidence as before, but with a quiet awareness that something had shifted, something that would not be undone by routine. Executives took their seats with measured movements, their conversations lower, shorter, more focused, because whatever had happened the day before had not faded overnight, it had sharpened. Daniel Whitmore entered last, his presence still commanding, but no longer unquestioned, and as he took his place at the head of the table, there was no need for an opening statement, no need to re-establish control, because control now required something else, something earned. His gaze moved briefly across the room before settling on Evelyn Carter, who stood at the same position as before, composed, prepared, her posture unchanged, but the perception of her entirely different. She stepped forward without being asked, placing a revised set of documents on the table. The motion simple, controlled, and in that simplicity, there was confidence. Not declared, not performed, but evident. Updated projections, she said, her voice steady, and as the documents were passed along, the room shifted into a new rhythm, one not driven by authority alone, but by understanding. Daniel did not interrupt, he did not question immediately, he reviewed, his attention focused, deliberate, tracing the structure she had built, and as the seconds passed, the silence that filled the room was no longer uncertain, it was concentrated, every person there aware that they were not just reviewing numbers, they were witnessing a recalibrated direction. Evelyn began to walk them through the model, her voice clear, her reasoning structured, each section connecting seamlessly to the next, and there was no hesitation, no need to defend, because the work spoke for itself, grounded, precise, undeniable. One by one, the executives followed. Their earlier skepticism replaced with engagement, their posture shifting forward, their attention fixed, because this was not just correction, it was clarity applied. Daniel leaned back slightly, the report in